Hey there, this is Dr. Jason Shumard, author of How to Reverse Your Diabetes and the Thyroid Epidemic. And today I wanted to continue our toxin topics. This is our part 3. If you haven't seen part 1 and part 2, I would recommend you go back and watch those videos prior to watching this one. But I'm going to do a quick review today's video of things we spoke about last time. And today we're going to be discussing how we evaluate for these types of toxins. This is a very important step in this process as we understand exactly the type of toxins the individual is dealing with, as we hone in on what needs to be done to specifically help them remove these toxins and the goals behind that as well. But just to review some things we talked about last time, we talked about the 3 different types of toxins that we normally see in the practice. We see biotoxins. Again, bio meaning living, so it's a living organism that typically gets into our body that starts expelling toxins. We see heavy metal toxins, and we see environmental toxins. So let's just go through some of those real briefly here again. Biotoxins are most commonly mold. We can see an individual who has mold, and we'll talk in depth about that today, how you can investigate to see if mold is a potential exposure you've had. MARCoNS, which is a multiple antibiotic bacterial infection. And then we have Lyme disease, which is a common one that we see. Many people know what that is. And then heavy metals, we can see lead. A common thing still to this day, people are getting lead exposures. Thinking that you can't get exposed to these things is really it's taking a blind spot to what really can be going on inside your body. Cadmium, mercury, and arsenic. We're going to discuss those today. We're going to talk a little bit more about where they can come from as well, and the exposures, and then how we will evaluate it in our office to determine what type of toxin the person is experiencing. And then obviously, we talked about the environmental toxins. We can get it from air. We have lots of pollution, food, chemicals that are just in generally that we get exposed to, maybe from pesticides and those sort of things. Those are common things that we get exposed to as well. And I talked a little bit about the importance of why toxins get into our body and how we get overburdened with these types of toxins. Genetics can play a role in that. Some of us have genetic predisposition that don't allow us to get rid of these toxins efficiently, and they can start to bog down our body, our ability to detoxify, specifically through liver detoxification, gallbladder, intestinal tract, kidneys. Even our skin is a process of elimination, so we need to make sure they're all functioning optimally, which is one of the key components here, because the second component is, or a combination, is that somebody may not have a potentially genetic predisposition, but they may have poor detoxification skills. So their liver's not working properly, their gallbladder, and so on. And so these things have to be investigated to see exactly what's going on under the surface as we start to put together a comprehensive solution or customized solution to help their body start functioning optimally again, so they can start working and functioning optimally again as well. So let's jump into how we're going to evaluate this. So if we go back to biotoxins, for example, we go to biotoxins, for example. Now, biotoxins, again, is a living organism that we get exposed to. Now, there's certain types of biotoxins that are more common than others, right? Being on the West Coast, we are more exposed to specific toxins than someone maybe on the East Coast. On the East Coast, they may be exposed more to Lyme disease, but we don't see that as much here on the West Coast that often. So when we look at biotoxins, we want to not only take into consideration the area the person lives in, but we also want to make sure we really investigate. Because mold, for example, most people may think, oh, mold is only exposed to people who live in environments who have a lot of humidity or those sort of things. That's not true. I want you to be very aware of what's really going on under the surface here. You can be exposed to mold and live in dry humidities, or dry climates. People in Denver, Colorado, who have extremely dry weather, or Phoenix, Arizona, or other desert areas, still have mold. The statistics tell us, this is through insurance model, like home insurance models, tell us that 70 to 80% of all homes across the United States have a mold exposure. Now, what's important as well is when you get a mold exposure, thinking, oh, I can't see mold in my home, is the wrong way of thinking things. And I talked about this a little bit in our part 2, but just to kind of reiterate this again, you could have a water damage situation that occurred in your bathroom, for example, and it flooded the floor, right? And then the remediation comes in, they start to dry everything up and clean everything up and make sure the walls are good and everything. But the mold spores are growing immediately from that. And mold spores become airborne. They can circulate to different areas around your home, fragment, and the next thing you know, we have little microscopic specks all over your home that fall on top of the TVs, the picture frames, the window sills, the door frames, just the walls themselves, and these can hang out in the dust of your home. We all have little specks of dust throughout the home. And they just continue to get worse over time. These fragments, we start breathing them in. Even though we don't see mold, right? You can still breathe these fragments in, still being exposed, still being inoculated. And this is a common thing that we see. So it's a very easy test that can be ran. It's a home mold test. It's called an ERMI test, E-R-M-I. And this test is a very important specific test to evaluate for fragments in DNA. So if you have elevated levels of specific DNA in the home, that could be toxic and harmful for your body. This test can be done by just basically like a little cloth. You're wiping different areas throughout your home, the dust particles, fold it back up, send it back to the lab. The lab then can send it back and say, okay, these are the areas that we found elevated in the home. Again, even though you may not see mold, you can still have this exposure. The common misconception is that if you don't see it, it's not there. That's not reality. Even some of the remediation companies will come out and they'll do an air capture test. Well, an air capture test is only going to catch active spores in most situations. You need to also do a culture test. A culture test will do that wiping down the dust and evaluating to see if there's current fragments that have the DNA of specific mold species. So we need to be more specific in our analysis process and not just evaluating to see if you have exposure in the home. Oftentimes, I won't even do that initially until we know that mold potentially can be a problem for the person, and we can evaluate that again through looking at genetics, like we talked about earlier. We can do a genetic blood lab test to see if genetics may play a role in your specific situation, and then if it does, which categories? Is it mold? Is it Lyme? Is it Marcons? What specifically, so that we can help us hone in. So let's just say we run a blood test, a genetic test, and mold comes back as susceptible. Now we're focusing, saying, okay, we have a toxic situation. This person potentially has a mold exposure. And before we do any of that, I've kind of jumped the gun here a little bit. We can also do a toxicity screening analysis, right? We can do a analysis that's a computerized screening analysis it's a questionnaire. So there's specific questions that are associated with toxins, and then we have a visual component as well. We know that toxicity can create inflammation in the body, and as it starts to migrate to the eyes, starts to compress the eyes, reducing the ability to see contrast, lighter to darker grays. It doesn't impact your visual acuity, meaning you'll be able to read, see letters, or even colors, but it does impact the seeing of the grays. This test is a 98% sensitive test. So oftentimes we'll do this test first just to do an evaluation or screening analysis. And if it comes back positive, since it is a 98% sensitive test, it's telling us that toxicity is definitely a problem in this individual that needs to be addressed. So then we can run that genetic test to say, okay, what type of genes do they have? And is it mold, Marcons, Lymes, that sort of thing, so we can hone in on that. But in this example, let's say it's mold. And so the person has a mold genetic susceptibility. They have a positive toxicity screening test. We now know that mold is a potential problem for this person. So then we can take one more step and we can find out exactly what types of mycotox, and mycotox is the toxin that is expelled by mold. All right, so when you have a mold exposure, and just so you know, you can have an exposure 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and it can still be bothering you today. It doesn't have to be an active exposure for you to be having these problems. So it can be, these things can build up inside your body and create issues. So now we've got a toxicity screening positive test. We have a genetic test that shows us that the person is susceptible to mold. Now we can run a follow-up test specific to mold to see what species and how much of the toxins. This is a urine test, very simple and easy test to be done, and it can tell us what specifically we're dealing with here.